What if the only person who knew the truth about a murder was the next victim? For years, Kathleen Savio's death was treated as a tragic household accident, an unfortunate fall in a bathtub. Police closed the file, labeling it an accidental drowning. But when Drew Peterson's fourth wife, Stacy, vanished without a trace, that old story began to unravel. Investigators reopened Kathleen's 2004 case, dusting off files long forgotten. And what they found raised more questions than answers. The bruises on her body didn't match a fall, the bathtub was dry, and the timing of her death, just days before a divorce settlement, revealed motive. The man who found her body wasn't a stranger or a passerby. He was her ex-husband, a veteran police sergeant, someone sworn to protect the community, yet capable of terrorizing his own home. Drew Peterson had spent decades behind a badge, but his uniform wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a shield, one that concealed a private world of jealousy, control, and manipulation. He wasn't just enforcing the law, he was using it to his advantage. Behind closed doors, Drew's charm turned into dominance, his confidence into intimidation. He controlled his wives, isolated them, and used his position to silence any challenge to his authority. Those closest to him lived in fear. But from the outside, he looked like the perfect officer, the perfect husband, the perfect neighbor. This is the story of how a man built his life on deception, and how two women paid the price for uncovering who he truly was. Kathleen Savio's death wasn't an accident. It was a warning that no one listened to, until another woman disappeared, and the truth could no longer stay buried. You're watching True Crime Wound, where real stories of love, betrayal, and justice unfold. If you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss the truth behind the next case. Drew Peterson had built his image carefully. To the outside world, he was everything a small-town officer should be: dependable, confident, and respected. As a Bolingbrook police sergeant, he knew how to command authority. People saw the uniform before they saw the man, and that distinction gave him power. But behind that clean reputation was a trail of broken marriages and frightened women. Peterson had been married 4 times. Each relationship followed the same pattern: charm, control, and collapse. He started young, marrying his high school sweetheart, Carol Brown. That marriage ended after she accused him of infidelity and manipulation. He quickly remarried, Vicky Connolly, and the cycle repeated. Vicky later described how Drew constantly spied on her, controlled her movements, and grew angry when she asserted herself. When she left, he wasted no time finding another partner, Kathleen Savio. She was independent, ambitious, and strong-willed. Traits Drew initially admired, but later tried to suppress. Their relationship began passionately, but soon turned toxic. Neighbors often heard shouting through the walls. Police were called to their home several times for domestic disturbances. Kathleen later told friends and relatives that she feared for her safety, even telling one, "If I die, it won't be an accident." At work, Drew Peterson was untouchable. His badge gave him credibility that few dared to question. Within the department, he was seen as experienced and capable, someone who understood the system inside and out. That reputation became his protection. When Kathleen complained about his behavior or threats, her words carried little weight against the credibility of a police sergeant. The control extended into their divorce. Their split was messy, filled with financial battles over property, pension, and custody of their 2 sons. Drew demanded control over every detail. For Kathleen, leaving him wasn't just emotional, it was dangerous. Friends noticed bruises, fear in her eyes, and a change in her demeanor. She documented his threats and filed reports, hoping it would protect her. But nothing changed. Drew still visited the home they once shared under the guise of checking on the kids. And with each visit, the tension grew heavier. Then, in March 2004, that tension reached its breaking point. At that time, Drew was already in a new relationship with a woman 30 years younger named Stacy Cales, who would soon become his fourth wife. Kathleen knew about her. The divorce had drained her emotionally and financially, but she was trying to rebuild her life. Drew, however, was never comfortable letting go. He wanted control even after the marriage ended. Kathleen's independence was something he couldn't tolerate, and when she stopped answering his calls, he decided to go to her home, a decision that would soon reveal a scene that raised more questions than answers. Behind the smile of a trusted officer, a darker reality had taken root. Drew Peterson wasn't just a man struggling through failed marriages. He was a man determined to control every woman who tried to leave him. And when control slipped from his hands, tragedy followed. The perfect facade was beginning to crack, and soon the image of a respected officer would collide with the truth hiding inside his own home. On the night of March 1st, 2004, Drew Peterson said he went to check on his ex-wife, Kathleen Savio, after she failed to answer her phone. He brought one of their sons along, saying he wanted to drop the boy off. When they arrived at her Bolingbrook home, something felt wrong. The house was dark and locked from the outside, unusual for Kathleen. Unable to get in, Drew went to a neighbor's house to borrow a key. The neighbor, noticing his concern, accompanied him. Together, they entered Kathleen's home. Moments later, they found her, motionless, lying in a dry bathtub. The scene was quiet. There were no signs of forced entry, no clear struggle visible at first glance. The bathtub was dry, and Kathleen's hair appeared matted but not soaked. Drew told police he believed she had accidentally drowned, perhaps slipping and hitting her head. But even in that first moment, something didn't add up. The coroner's office conducted a brief investigation, ruling the death an accidental drowning. But the evidence never truly supported that story. Kathleen had multiple bruises on her back, arms, and legs, and a small wound on her head. Yet the official conclusion was that she must have slipped and fallen in the tub. There was little follow-up, and no one questioned Drew's account in depth. Peterson, standing as veteran police officer, likely shaped how the scene was handled. Officers responding that night knew him personally. Few people wanted to believe that one of their own could be involved in something darker. The investigation was brief, and the case was quickly closed. At the time, Kathleen's divorce proceedings with Drew were still ongoing. They were due back in court within weeks to finalize the division of assets, including his pension and their home. Her death meant those disputes would never be settled. Financially, Drew stood to benefit. Friends and family, however, were not convinced by the official explanation. They remembered Kathleen as cautious, organized, and in good health. The dry bathtub confused everyone. How could someone drown in a tub that was empty when she was found? Still, the case remained closed. Drew remarried within months to the much younger Stacy Cales, who became his fourth wife. He moved on quickly, blending his new marriage into the image of a happy family man. But behind the scenes, questions lingered. Kathleen's relatives continued to voice concerns, insisting her death didn't make sense. They spoke to reporters and investigators, but there wasn't enough evidence to reopen the case. For 3 years, Kathleen Savio's death remained an accident, a story accepted by police, recorded by the court, and buried along with her. It wasn't until another tragedy struck, one that hit much closer to home, that investigator would finally be forced to revisit everything they thought they knew. Because when Drew Peterson's next wife disappeared, Kathleen's case came back from the grave. By October 2007, Drew Peterson seemed settled again. He was 53 years old, married to 23-year-old Stacy Cales, and living what looked like a stable family life in Bolingbrook, Illinois. To the outside world, he was the image of confidence, a man with experience, a father of 6, and a respected former police sergeant. But inside their home, things were unraveling fast. Stacy had grown distant. Friends noticed she looked anxious, withdrawn, and was constantly checking over her shoulder. She confided in her pastor, Neil Shorey, telling him she felt trapped and afraid. She said Drew was controlling. He monitored her phone calls, tracked her movements, and often questioned her about things she hadn't even done. She told those close to her that her marriage felt like a prison, and at just 23, she was raising not only her 2 children with Drew, but also helping care for his children from previous marriages. She was exhausted, isolated, and emotionally overwhelmed. On October 28, 2007, everything changed. That morning, Stacy spoke briefly with her sister, Cassandra. She said she planned to meet a friend to paint a house. That was the last anyone heard from her. Later that day, Drew told police a different story. That Stacy had called him, saying she was leaving him for another man. He claimed she ran off, abandoning her car, her purse, and her children, but her family knew that wasn't true. Stacy would never leave her kids behind. Within hours, her sister reported her missing, sparking one of the most publicized searches in Illinois history. Police began retracing Drew's timeline, and the inconsistencies appeared immediately. He couldn't clearly account for his whereabouts. His vehicles had been cleaned. Some of his neighbors recalled seeing him loading large plastic containers into his SUV around the same time Stacy disappeared. At first, Drew was calm, almost smug. He laughed off interviews, joked with reporters, and dismissed the accusations as media nonsense. But as investigators dug deeper, old ghosts started to resurface. When detectives reviewed his history, they noticed something odd. Drew's 3rd wife, Kathleen Savio, had died under unusual circumstances just 3 years earlier. Her death had been labeled accidental, but now, with his 4th wife missing, that accident looked far more suspicious. Authorities reopened Kathleen's case, exhuming her body for a second autopsy. What they found changed everything. The medical examiner concluded that Kathleen's death was a homicide, not an accident. The bruises, the deep cut on her head, the position of her body, all pointed to foul play. She hadn't slipped and fallen. She had been held down and drowned. This revelation turned Drew from a concerned husband into a prime suspect in 2 cases, one dead wife, one missing. Search teams combed fields, rivers, and forests looking for Stacy, but her body was never found. Still, the mounting evidence began closing in on him. Phone records, witness accounts, and testimony from Stacy's pastor painted a picture of a man desperate to maintain control, one whose charm and authority had masked years of manipulation. The story that once seemed like a simple missing person case had transformed into something much darker, the unraveling of a man who thought he was untouchable. When investigators reopened Kathleen Savio's case, they knew they were stepping into dangerous territory. Drew Peterson wasn't just any suspect, he was one of their own. A former police sergeant with decades of experience, he knew exactly how investigations worked. He knew what to say, what not to say, and how to stay just one step ahead. But this time, the walls were closing in. The exhumation of Kathleen's body was a turning point. The second autopsy, conducted by a respected pathologist, revealed that Kathleen had sustained multiple deep bruises and a gash on the back of her head, injuries inconsistent with a simple fall in a bathtub. Her body position didn't fit the scene either. The evidence now clearly indicated she had been forcibly drowned. Investigators revisited Drew's statements from 2004. They learned that he had gone to Kathleen's house with his son to drop the boy off. When no one answered, Drew claimed he found the front door locked from the outside, an odd detail. He went to a neighbor's house, borrowed a key, and together they entered the home. That's when they found Kathleen's body in the bathtub. The scene looked off. Her hair was wet, but the tub was almost dry. and Drew, the first to discover her, seemed oddly composed. His police connections had helped shape the initial narrative, a tragic accident. But now, with Stacy's disappearance bringing the case back into focus, everything Drew said and did was under scrutiny. Detectives began to piece together a pattern, one that stretched across his marriages. His first wife, Carol Brown, described him as charming but quick to anger. His second wife, Vicky Connolly, spoke of constant manipulation, control, and threats. And Kathleen, his third, had written in letters and court documents that she feared Drew might kill her and make it look like an accident. It was as if every marriage followed the same script. Drew would begin as the attentive, protective husband. Then slowly, jealousy and control would take over. He'd monitor, isolate, accuse, and eventually replace one wife with another, each younger than the last. The turning point came when Stacy's pastor, Neil Shorey, stepped forward. Though limited in what he could share, his account hinted at fear, secrecy, and guilt weighing heavily on Stacy before she vanished. She was scared, and she was beginning to realize the danger she was in. Meanwhile, Drew continued to play the media like a game. He appeared on talk shows, cracked jokes, and even flirted with reporters. While search teams scoured rivers and fields for Stacy, Drew laughed about dating again. His arrogance only fueled public outrage. But behind the cameras, the investigation intensified. Detectives quietly built a case, not just on emotion, but on evidence. Forensics, witness statements, and timeline inconsistencies painted a picture of premeditation and control. In 2009, 5 years after Kathleen's death, prosecutors charged Drew Peterson with first-degree murder. The same man who once wore a badge now stood handcuffed, accused of killing his wife. But as the trial approached, one haunting question remained. What really happened to Stacy? Even without her body, her absence became the loudest evidence of all. A missing voice that refused to be silenced. When the trial for Kathleen Savio's murder began in 2012, the nation watched closely. This wasn't just about one woman's death. It was about how a police officer trusted to protect others could manipulate the very system meant to hold him accountable. Drew Peterson entered the courtroom calm, confident, and even smirking at times. To many, he still played the role of the charming ex-cop. But prosecutors were ready to strip away that facade. They opened with a powerful theme. Kathleen didn't slip. She was silenced. One of the biggest challenges was that there were no direct eyewitnesses, and much of the physical evidence had been compromised during the initial 2004 investigation. But prosecutors had something far more compelling: Kathleen's own words and the testimony of those who knew her fear. Friends, family members, and neighbors testified that Kathleen had repeatedly expressed concern for her safety. She had told multiple people, "If I die, it won't be an accident." Those words, chilling yet prophetic, now echoed through the courtroom. Prosecutors also detailed the volatile relationship between Drew and Kathleen. They showed how Drew's jealousy had escalated when she filed for divorce and sought full custody of their children. The timing of her death, just days before their divorce settlement, painted a clear motive. But the most crucial testimony came indirectly through Stacy Peterson. Though she was missing, her voice lingered in the form of statements she made to others before she disappeared. Her pastor, Neil Shorey, and a close friend, Scott Rossetto, recounted the distress and fear she expressed in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. She had hinted at knowing something terrible about Kathleen's death, something that weighed heavily on her. Though the defense argued that her statements were hearsay, the court admitted them under a special exception known as the Drew's Law provision, passed in Illinois after her disappearance. That law allowed hearsay evidence when a defendant was believed to have intentionally silenced a witness, and prosecutors argued that Drew had done exactly that. Piece by piece, the prosecution dismantled his image as a decorated officer. They exposed his pattern of dominance, manipulation, and control, not just in his marriages, but in his professional life as well. Colleagues spoke of his arrogance and how he often used his badge to intimidate others. When the defense tried to portray Kathleen's death as a freak accident, the forensic evidence countered every claim. The dry bathtub, the bruising pattern, the position of her body, nothing fit Drew's story. After weeks of testimony and years of anticipation, the jury deliberated for just 14 hours. On September 6, 2012, they returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. As the verdict was read, Drew stood motionless. For the first time, his confidence cracked. He was sentenced to 38 years in prison for the murder of Kathleen Savio. But even as he was led away, one haunting truth remained unresolved: the disappearance of Stacy Peterson. Her body was never found, and Drew has never been charged in connection with her case. Still, her absence became the most powerful testimony of all, the missing voice that ultimately brought justice for another woman. Years later, Drew would face even more time after attempting to solicit a hit on the prosecutor who convicted him. A desperate act from a man who once believed he was untouchable. Behind bars, the man who once wore the badge now lives in the shadows of the very justice system he once manipulated. And while Kathleen's family finally saw justice served, Stacy's loved ones continue to wait, holding on to hope that one day her story will also have an ending. In the end, the story of Drew Peterson isn't just about one man's crimes. It's a story about power, how it can be used to protect, and how it can be twisted to control. For years, Drew hid behind his badge, his charm, and the image of a dedicated police officer. He was the kind of man people trusted. The neighbor who waved every morning, the officer who responded to calls, the husband who seemed confident and composed. But behind that calm exterior was a trail of broken trust, fear, and manipulation. Kathleen Savio tried to speak out, but her voice was buried under paperwork and doubt. It took another woman's disappearance to finally uncover the truth. And though Stacy Peterson never got the chance to tell her story in court, her silence spoke louder than words. Her disappearance forced investigators to look closer, to reopen doors that should never have been closed, and to expose the dark reality behind the badge. In the process, they brought justice for Kathleen and gave voice to victims who had been silenced for far too long. Today, Drew Peterson remains behind bars, once a man of authority, now a symbol of betrayal. His story serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always hide in the dark. Sometimes it wears a uniform and smiles in plain sight. For the families of Kathleen and Stacy, the pain never fades. One found justice, the other still waits for answers. But both remind us of the same truth: that no matter how carefully lies are built, they eventually crumble under the weight of truth. This has been the case of Drew Peterson, a man who believed he could outsmart the system, only to be undone by the very justice he once served. You've been watching True Crime Wound. If you believe every story deserves to be heard, every truth deserves to come to light, remember to subscribe so we can continue uncovering the cases that still echo through time. Because justice may be delayed, but it's never truly gone.